It's Saturday, and it's after dark. Time to get spooky with the less sexy half of Feen and Greg. Here's your host.
Welcome to Greg After Dark. I'm Greg, and it's time to get dead and disorderly. This is an official spinoff of the Feen and Greg Show, but I'm taking you down a very different road. We're leaving the intelligent, enlightened discourse of the main feed behind and plunging straight into the gutter of the unexplained. The dark, murky stuff. The real mysteries, ghost stories, cold-blooded murders, and how the hell Keith Richards is still alive. One of my favorite things about doing Feen and Greg is doing the Halloween episodes. So I decided to take my obsession with all things paranormal and the unsolved and drag it 3 floors below the Studio of Love. And somehow the higher-ups thought this was a great idea. So there's no Feen, no Maggie, no Tim. Just me, a cold microphone, that dill knob Sergio in the booth, and Carter's expensive yet gorgeous ass. So I have to start using a script now, so I guess I can't just rely on swearing all the time, and I guess I have to actually learn how to read. Damn it. But I digress. Ladies and gentlemen,
welcome to Greg After Dark.
Grab a flashlight, check the locks, and pull up a chair. Let's turn down the lights and hand it over to the man who willingly reads about this stuff so you don't have to. It's time for Greg After Dark.
Well, it's Saturday, and it's midnight. The witching hour is officially open, and while the rest of the world is tucked safely under the covers, sleeping off terrible life choices and cheap takeout, here we are, wide awake, staring right into the dark abyss of history, and it's staring right back. Forget about Jack the Ripper. Everybody knows what happened in London in 1888, but 4 years earlier, across the Atlantic in quiet, polite Austin, Texas, somehow someone was doing something eerily similar, but somehow seemingly far worse. Ripping people out of their beds in the middle of the night and vanishing into the air. Welcome to America's first recorded serial killer mystery. So picture Austin, Texas, in the mid-1880s. It's dusty, it's dirty, but it's supposed to be a booming, peaceful capital city. And it's sweltering hot. The kind of thick Texas summer heat where, nobody has air conditioning. So everyone sleeps with their windows flung wide open just to catch a stray molecule of a breeze. At the time, a large portion of the domestic working class servants were living in small, detached back cottages or upstairs rooms behind the grand houses of the wealthy. They were isolated, they were vulnerable, and completely exposed to whoever or whatever was walking the dirt streets after midnight. On December 30th, 1884, the nightmare officially begins. A domestic servant named Molly Smith and her common-law husband, Walter Spencer, are asleep in their room. In the dead of night, an intruder slipped inside. Walter is violently attacked and left for dead with severe head injuries. Molly is dragged out into the dark yard and brutally murdered. When Walter regains consciousness, he describes an attacker who moved like a phantom, masked, silent, and terrifyingly fast. But the cops of 1884 figure, hey, it's just an isolated incident, right? Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Because as the months roll on and the Texas heat turns brutal again in 1885, the killer returns with a vengeance. And the weapons he used? Absolute nightmare fuel. He didn't just stick to one thing. He used whatever was lying around or brutal enough to get the job done. Axes, heavy iron bars, butcher knives, even the blunt back end of an axe to completely cave in a victim's forehead. And the state of the bodies, man, that's where it gets a little darker. The MO was often that the victims were attacked in their beds, but then dragged outdoors, stripped or partially clothed, leaving them in the dirt, the wash houses, or the backyard grass. Contemporary medical reports describe skulls beaten literally into jelly and heads nearly split in two. In one attack, a victim's arm was almost entirely sliced through. And just so you're getting a good vision of just what a psycho this guy was, in one of the most twisted details of the entire spree, the killer broke into a home, knocked out a mother with a heavy sandbag, and then drove a sharp iron pin straight through an 11-year-old girl's ear into her brain. Where the hell did he even find an iron pin that long? It kind of seems like the guy just had all the time in the world to really peruse through all these items at the scene, and he's just doing nope. Oh, a 6-inch iron pin. Oh yeah, that'll do. Good. And the psychological terror was just off the charts. Survivors and children hiding under the covers reported hearing phantom footsteps, soft whistling in the dark, and barefoot tracks left in the dirt outside windows where the killer had silently stalked them. Men in the city started sleeping on their porches with shotguns loaded for bear, and everybody kind of realized that 19th century home security kind of sucked. Really, it just consisted of a wooden screen door and a couple of prayers.
If you're loving all things spooky, join us every Saturday at midnight for Greg After Dark.
Let's get to something of a victim roster, shall we? As mentioned before, December 30th, 1884, Molly Smith is our guy's first victim. Molly's common-law husband, Walter Spencer, he woke up severely wounded with gashes to his head. He managed to stagger to their employer's main house at around 3 a.m., and he's just bleeding profusely. And he gasped, "Molly's gone." Hours later, around 9 a.m., a neighbor's servant found Molly's body lying in the backyard behind a small outhouse. She was found nearly naked, having been dragged from her bed. She suffered a massive, gaping wound in the side of her head. Inside her bedroom, police found the blood-stained axe left behind on the floor, surrounded by broken glass and bloody fingerprints. On May 7th, 1885, there's Eliza Shelley. A neighbor had heard screams coming from Eliza's cabin in the morning and sent her young nieces to investigate. That's very brave of you, thank you. The niece found Eliza dead on the floor, while Eliza's traumatized 8-year-old son sat dazed in the room. She had a gaping wound over her right eye, a deep round hole stabbed just above her ear, and another puncture right between her eyes. The killer had ripped her off of her bed, wrapped her body in a blood-soaked bedspread, and left the room's pillows and sheets entirely saturated in blood. And then, on May 22nd, 1885, we have Irene Cross. And unlike the other victims, who were attacked quietly in their sleep, Irene woke during the attack and managed to get out of her employer's house, staggering into the open air while screaming for help, with her young son trailing behind her. She had been slashed with a knife rather than an axe, and she had a massive 6-inch gash that nearly sliced her right arm in half, and a brutal horizontal slash across her head just above her eyes that looked like he had attempted to scalp her. So Irene managed to stumble out of her employer's house on her own, just screaming. She survived just long enough to talk to police and give a description of her attacker before ultimately succumbing to her injuries hours later. Fast forward 3 months later to August 30th, 1885, to the deaths of Mary and Rebecca Ramey. Police arrived at a scene of absolute carnage in the backyard. 11-year-old Mary Ramey was found dying outdoors while her mother Rebecca lay inside with a fractured skull from being struck with a sandbag. Young Mary had been dragged into a wash house, and aside from the severe physical trauma, the killer had driven an iron pin directly into both of her ears, deep into her brain. She bled to death shortly after officers arrived. And nearly a month later, on September 28, 1885, the killer doubled down with Gracie Vance in Orange, Washington. A night of terror where multiple people were hacked in a single room, with boarders waking up in the morning and discovering the bloody aftermath. Orange, Washington and Gracie Vance were butchered in their beds. Gracie's body was mutilated so severely and left in such a massive pool of blood inside the room that contemporary accounts noted it looked as though her body was literally floating in it. Then, there was the Christmas Eve massacre. December 24th, 1885, Eula Phillips and Susan Hancock. The final strike occurred that night. 17-year-old Eula Phillips was found brutally murdered outdoors near her home, while 40-year-old Susan Hancock was found dead in her bed. Eula had been dragged out onto the ground while her husband slept nearby, her head split open with an axe. The sheer brutality of this final dual murder threw Austin into an irreversible panic. The famous short story writer, his pen name, O. Henry. Oh, is that where they got the name of the chocolate bar from? Anyway, his real name was William Sidney Porter, and he was actually living in Austin, Texas, right when these murders were happening. In a May 10th, 1885 letter to his friend Dave Hall, which was later published in his book Rolling Stones, O. Henry wrote, "This town is fearfully dull, except for the frequent raids of the Servant Girl Annihilators, who make things lively in the dull hours of the night. This is literally where the moniker Servant Girl Annihilator came from, coined as a dark joke by a legendary author who was living through the panic. And he gained another name, the Midnight Assassin." News like this doesn't just stay local. But in December 29th in 1885, the Fort Worth Daily Gazette, it featured harrowing headlines like, "Austin still the field of the Midnight Assassin, 2 horrible murders in one night," following the double murder of Gracie Vance in Orange, Washington. And the Austin newspaper, the Austin Daily Statesman, was absolutely fierce, just blasting the city administration and the police marshal for corruption, inefficiency, and letting quote-unquote unbridled ruffians spread terror. But you gotta think, at the time, the city police force consisted of only a handful of active officers at any given time. So that news made its way all the way to New York, and the New York Times in December 26, 1885 published a front-page national feature on the Austin Terror, noting that the murders were committed by some cunning madman who is insane on the subject of killing women. It also reported that over 400 men had been arrested by a desperate police force over the course of that single year. For obvious reasons, the city of Austin literally went dark. Residents boarded up windows, businesses bought weapons in bulk, and citizens became so paranoid that people started shooting at shadows, suspecting neighbors, and whispering about whether a demonic entity was walking among them. But demonic entities aside, just something to think about. At almost every single crime scene, investigators found bare footprints in the mud or dusted onto the floorboards. And even creepier, the prints belonged to a man who was missing a toe, or at least had severe scar tissue where his smallest toe should have been. And he always walked away from these horrific scenes. He never ran. So, by late 1885, as suddenly and inexplicably as it had started, the bloodshed stopped. The Servant Girl Annihilator vanished into thin air, leaving the identity of America's first serial killer locked away in the shadows forever. So, over the years, historians and modern true crime sleuths have proffered just about every theory in the book. And parallel to the Jack the Ripper case, the thought of the killer being an educated white man was just out of the question, even though historical data suggests that more than half of all serial killers are Caucasian, but, never mind that. And like the Ripper case, some pointed to immigrants, an ethnic roving maniac, or early traveling circus workers. Others, they had very different theories. So really, who was doing this? Naturally, 1880s law enforcement handled it with all the precision of a sledgehammer to a glass sculpture. They rounded up hundreds of black and immigrant men trying to pin it on some grand criminal conspiracy, but here's the kicker. The murders kept happening even while their main suspects were safely locked up behind bars. And with no playbook for serial killers at the time, 19th century police heavily relied on suspecting people close to the victims. So James Phillips, the husband in the Christmas Eve massacre of 1885, and husband of Eula Phillips, he was actually arrested, tried, and convicted of his wife's murder. Witnesses testified that he had frequently threatened to kill her if she was ever unfaithful. However, the conviction was later overturned due to a glaring lack of solid evidence, and most modern historians doubt he was the serial killer. Also, early on, police arrested various former lovers, neighbors, and local men, such as William Brooks or Ike Plummer, based on minor domestic disputes or being seen barefoot near the houses. Hundreds of people were swept up, questioned, and ultimately released because the murders continued while these suspects were all locked up. And then, it starts to get a little wilder. There's the Jack the Ripper connection. Because the Whitechapel murders in London began just 3 years later in 1888, and they shared a similarly brutal, targeted approach toward women, newspapers and armchair detectives at the time began asking if the Austin killer had fled overseas. While it makes for an incredible true crime crossover podcast episode, there's zero archival proof linking the Austin killer to London. However, contemporary newspapers widely entertain the idea that the cunning madman had simply exported his terror. And because the killer was able to slip into heavily guarded yards without waking up barking watchdogs or raising alarms, segments of the local population, including superstitious locals and the African American community living under intense racial tension, theorized that the killer was a white man using magic or voodoo to become invisible. Others whispered that the killer was a master of disguise, rumored at various points to be a light-skinned black man using lamp black makeup to alter his skin tone, or a man prowling the alleys wearing women's Mother Hubbard-style dress to blend in unnoticed. As far as suspects go, I'm pretty partial to a 19-year-old African-American cook living and working in Austin during the height of the panic. His name was Nathan Elgin. Decades after the killings, using modern geographic and psychological profiling, investigators and historians kind of pointed to Elgin. He lived in very close proximity to multiple murder scenes. Most compellingly, Elgin was missing his small toe, which eerily matched the distinct recurring barefoot prints left at the crime scenes, where the killer's right pinky toe was noticeably absent. In February 1886, just weeks after the final murders, Elgin was shot and killed by Austin police officers. He had gone on a violent rampage, attempting to slash a young girl with a knife in broad daylight. Following his death, oddly enough, the murders abruptly stopped, leading many to believe that he could have been the elusive midnight assassin. Well, a volatile, hot-tempered woman slashing psychopath missing a pinky toe. I'm not exactly Sherlock Holmes, but hey, if the shoe fits. Well, that's all the terror that we have time for tonight. If you're liking this new format, this new spin-off show, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to write in with your story ideas or your own personal experiences, maybe you've been haunted or had something spooky happen to you. Maybe you're a violent sociopath who is killed over and over again, and I'm not here to judge you. Let other people judge you. So write in at feenandgreg@feenandgreg.com and visit the website at www.feenandgreg.com. There's a link for Greg After Dark. Thank you so much for listening. And we'll be back next Saturday at midnight for more Greg After Dark. And remember, keep the lights on, keep your eyes on the shadows, and never answer when someone calls your name from the dark.
Thank you for joining us After Dark. We'll be back every Saturday at midnight to ruin your sleep schedule all over again. Boom! Gotcha, didn't I?